Welcome to Energize and Revitalize with Dr. Amy. I'm Dr. Amy Cooper Smith, a doctor prepared nurse practitioner. And this show is about empowering you to ask questions, explore different perspectives, and make informed decisions about your health. I'm very excited to introduce today's guest, Dr. Anil Bajnath. He is a board certified physician specializing in precision and longevity medicine. He's the founder and president of the American Board of Precision Medicine and the author of The Biological 401k, coming out soon. So welcome and thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me, Dr. Amy. It's a true pleasure.
Yeah, so you are the founder of the Board of Precision Medicine. So what is precision medicine?
That's a great question. So precision medicine is kind of defined by the National Institute of Health as the interface of biology, lifestyle, and environment. To me, that just sounds like really good medicine. And to take it a step further, precision medicine leverages very unique molecular tests that aren't routinely conventionally ordered. It was originally kind of predicated on genomic medicine applications, genetic applications, but in more recent decades, we're building on those different molecular layers to include additional levels of testing of RNA. And RNA is basically how genes are behaving instead of like what DNA I have, how that gene is being expressed or not expressed. And then we look at proteomics, which are proteins. We look at metabolomics, which are the byproduct of cellular metabolism. We look at the microbiome, which is all the bacteria in our gut, in our mouth, and other areas of the body. And we look at the exposome, which is basically the environmental interface on how these different environmental toxins are either bioaccumulating and or being detoxed and influencing our overall health expression.
Wow, so that's a lot. And I know the field is advancing very quickly. And so how can people navigate this, broad field of medicine?
So it's very interesting. That's why I started the board. So I faculty at George Washington University, where I was teaching a course, INTM 6205, to fellows on the omics of medicine. And essentially, we were training providers and physicians on how to leverage these different data points into clinical practice. And, from there, it kind of gave rise to the American Board of Precision Medicine because there was an unmet educational need and gap that we identified and realized that it needs to go beyond the university and now on a national level so that all physicians could start leaning into, healthcare 3.0 or the medicine of the future that's here today. And so with that being said, by definition, precision medicine and multiomics as a whole, all the literature and clinical studies are going towards multiomics, that narrative genome, transcriptome, proteome, metabolome, all those different variables into clinical research studies, but also into clinical practice. Now, by definition, multiomics is 3 molecular layers and 5,000 data points. And there's not one person that can, be the supercomputer to navigate all that information. So with that being said, a lot of this is going to rely on AI, machine learning, and other advanced tools to kind of highlight and connect those molecular dots in a translational application for clinical readiness and application. And that's what I do in my private practice, the Institute for Human Optimization here in Maryland.
How much is AI working with all of this right now?
It's very interesting because we could do it in a segmented fashion, right? With looking at just genetics, okay? So if we were to just take one layer and that your DNA blueprint, your book of life, 23 chapters or 23 chromosomes, there's different stories within there, right? And being able to leverage that information in a clinically meaningful way has varying levels of application. So with that being said, AI could go in there and basically scan those 23 chapters and, hundreds of thousands of base pairs, millions of different potential regions, and be able to identify areas that could be associated with, let's say, genetic predisposition towards some sort of shift in the chemistry, okay? And so there are different clinical applications of genetics that go beyond our classical understanding of it that we're taught in med school. There are these inborn errors of metabolism and rare genetic diseases. That's very clinically relevant, but what about all of us that has this unique blueprint and the 99% of the clinical application? Well, that's where, AI is actually aggregating and helping with identifying what's called polygenic risk scores. So a cluster of genes that are associated with a specific phenotype or health outcome or expression. There's other applications, including pharmacogenomics and looking at whether or not you're going to respond favorably or unfavorably to a drug or medication or intervention. And that's very clinically relevant. Statins, one of the most prescribed drugs and medications in the world. There's a certain genetic genotype, SLCO1B1, that's associated with being statin intolerant. And that risk for myopathy is increased. So very important, for all those folks that are out there and they're like, hey, I started a statin and unfortunately I like my fatigue and muscle and all. Very important clinical molecular association that's not oftentimes looked at. And there are other, nutrigenomic clinical applications of looking at how your genes respond to micronutrients and how micronutrients respond to your genes. Very interesting correlation there. I personally have a VDR polymorphism that influences my vitamin D kinetics, and I need higher amounts of vitamin D to maintain normal levels, just normal, barely normal levels, compared to some others. So there's multiple different applications. AI is going to be very important at kind of identifying, stratifying, and, navigating those complex issues. But, again, I always tell my patients, your DNA is not your destiny. And that's actually in the book, and that we actually could leverage this information for empowerment and very important clinical decision making.
Yeah. So speaking of the predisposition, so let's say I have some testing done and I actually in reality have a predisposition toward ankylosing spondylosis. I don't have it, but what can I do to prevent that gene from expressing?
Fantastic. Great question. HLA-B27 is what you're
Yes.
referring to.
Yes.
And, I think, well, what is ankylosing spondylitis, right? It's actually a multifactorial inflammatory issue, simply put, right? It affects the spine, could lead to something called bamboo spine, right? Which is due to all that fibrotic tissue affecting the column there. And for what I would do actually on a clinical level is not just look at that genetic predisposition, but look at the milieu. Now, one of the very interesting molecular associations that I see is the influence of the microbiome on clinical expression. What do you mean? All the bacteria in your gut could be linked to all these crazy signals. There was a study that just came out recently that is now linking multiple sclerosis to two very specific bacteria strains in a twin study. One twin had MS, the other twin didn't. They did a whole survey of the genetics and everything else, and they looked at the microbiome and they identified two very specific bacteria that are associated with the MS predisposition. So I say that because when I do a microbiome profile, I'm also looking at the gut. And if there are these autoimmune inflammatory microorganisms that are present, right, that's an area that we could target. I would also look at your immune system that goes beyond traditional, white blood cell count and differential. I would look at other signals of interleukin signaling and inflammatory signaling, beyond a traditional ESR or C-reactive protein, which are traditional markers for inflammatory, and look at, TGF beta 1, MMP9, and other markers that are signaling architectural shift in physiology towards that subtle stealth inflammatory remodeling that's taking place behind the scene, and try to attenuate that by identifying all the different biomarkers, microbiome factors, and so forth that could be associated with chronic inflammatory expression that we just don't typically look at on a routine basis. I hope that makes sense. And then there's a bunch of other things that we would do to make sure optimized and dialed in. I can't even begin to tell you,
Yeah. So if you examine the microbiome and you find inflammatory markers, can you treat them?
So it's very interesting. So it's not this is a very new and emerging kind of science about microbiome medicine. And what I tell my patients is, I look at not necessarily the microbial population, I pay attention to that, but that's going to change from BM to BM, bowel movement to bowel movement, literally, right?
Yep.
Right. So more so, I'm looking at the digestive physiology, and am I seeing signatures of dysbiosis and imbalance in gut bacteria? And if so, what's there? And what are the evidence-based interventions that we could deploy to target the shift in ecology? How do we support digestive physiology overall? And that's actually in my book. We talk about the 5R functional medicine approach to restoring digestive health. We got to remove certain things, replace certain things, repair certain things, replace all these little, there's a very strategic way of approaching the microbial biodiversity and going in there and fortifying it and making sure that there's no environmental mismatch with the microbial diversity, because certain bacteria grow and proliferate based on the foods you're eating. So you might see a signature that is highly predicated on a high animal-based protein, low fiber diet that is now cranking out all these secondary metabolites like putrescine and cadaverine, which is leading to inflammation and all these other things. And it actually, there's a gut-brain axis there that we need to pay attention to. Believe it or not, your gut is your second brain. Arguably could be your primary brain. And there's a bidirectional communication between the two that's influencing your mood, energy, focus and concentration, over your behavior, your cravings, all sorts of things. So it really depends on what we see. If we see candida overgrowth due to historical antibiotic use, that influences so many other factors on how we approach your diet. A low sugar diet, right? Are there other signatures of gluten intolerance, like anti-gliadin antibodies that are being formed, on a low level now that gluten's becoming an inflammatory trigger and burden for that individual? So there's a lot of information that we would deploy or use to deploy personalized interventions based on the data and signals that we're getting. If that makes sense. I hope I answered your question.
Oh, yes. Yes. So we're seeing a lot of autoimmune disease in our population. And I can tell you, in the regular population, we don't really know what to do with it.
Mhm.
So can using your platform, can that help guide treatment options for autoimmunity?
So I don't want to make any claims, right? And however, I will say this. When I do my full multi-omic profile on folks, one of the biggest thing that I see is an environmental genetic mismatch. And that's very significant. So I actually measure all of the different environmental toxins that you could be potentially exposed to: glyphosate or organophosphates, pesticides, herbicides, fungicides. I measure heavy metals and PFAS, microplastics, phthalates and parabens, mycotoxins. And that burden actually, weakens your system as a whole. And each one could be broken down into a very specific, kind of target. So like, mycophenolic acid, which is a mycotoxin that could be coming from certain foods or, water damaged buildings, leads to nephrotoxicity or kidney damage. Okay. There's a whole host, microplastics, New England Journal of Medicine last year, I believe the study was, found microplastics in the center of atheromas, right, which are plaque accumulations in the arteries, right? Heavy metals are found in the brain. So all these different environmental toxicants influence, I think, the immunological miscommunication. There's a very interesting concept in German New Medicine based on Hans Reckewig. Dr. Hans Reckewig was a homotoxicologist in Germany and described in a very simple chart the pathophenotypical progression towards disease and immunological dysfunction in autoimmunity and cancer. Things terminated into autoimmunity and cancer. And he basically said, hey, if you can't detox, right, you can't eliminate something, you're going to inflame. And when you inflame, you lead to chronic, what does he call it? Not infection, but the things, impregnation of the tissue. So if you can't biotransform and eliminate something, and it bioaccumulates and deposits in your tissue. And when it deposits in the tissue, the immune system then senses, hey, what is this? It doesn't belong here. And it eats that thing, and that thing with the tissue gets, kind of cross joined together. And that's where theoretically some of the autoimmune missignaling takes place, right?
So you think it's more environmental because that stuff is everywhere. So those are the things contributing to autoimmunity rather than gut dysbiosis or leaky gut or something like that,
I'm not going to say
or
it's one
both.
variable. I'm going
Yeah.
to say it's everything, right? And there's not one solid answer, right? I do see individuals with, raging autoimmune conditions that have a gut dysbiotic profile consistent with autoimmune bacteria. And
Mhm.
then when I measure their environmental toxic burden, it's just like through the roof with all sorts of different toxins and that they're being unknowingly being exposed to.
Right.
So it's hard to say what is the main trigger and mediator influencing that.
Yeah.
Like, I think there's a again, back to Reckowig's principle of homotoxicology, there's a biological threshold where people cross over, where there's a point of no return, where the immune system just gets kind of hijacked and dysregulated. And you could work on different levels to try to reverse that issue. But again, the German, the Swiss, the Austrians, they work, a little bit different than how we do here in the US on certain aspects when it comes down to an integrative approach. And when I was in undergrad, I studied with, a lot of clinics out of Europe. And I could share a bunch of stories with you, but yeah, it's very interesting that their philosophical approach to how these things kind of transpire.
That's fascinating. We're going to pause for a break from our sponsor. You're listening to Energize and Revitalize with Dr. Amy. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Energize and Revitalize with Dr. Amy. I'm Dr. Amy Cooper Smith, and my guest today is Anil Bajnath. Before the break, we were talking about precision medicine, genomics, autoimmunity, and how sometimes when people end up in a state of autoimmune, in a situation, they get to the point of no return. So when you said that, I thought, no return. So what can people do when they find themselves in this situation?
Well, it just depends, right? I definitely think it's going to be important to work with your rheumatologist to get medically optimized and stabilized. And then you could then start peeling back the different molecular layers to identify the antecedents, triggers, and mediators that are influencing their pathophenotype or disease process. That's what I do. I say, hey, go, speak to your cardiologist, rheumatologist, whoeverologist, whatever. See what they say.
Mhm.
Right. And then, get medically optimized, get on the appropriate pharmaceutical or adjunctive therapy, whatever it might be. And then let's reverse engineer what's going on here as you've been stabilized. And for my patients, oftentimes, there's a lot of little things that we start looking at to navigate their N of one kind of presentation. So
Mhm.
I call everything I do N of one. N of one is a scientific term for studies where you, the individual, are at the center of your own biological study, right? And that's where we're at. Because in medicine, the art of medicine is actually taking, this concept of evidence-based medicine, which is looking at the literature, the science, these large randomized placebo double-blinded control studies, and then trying to make sense on whether or not that intervention is going to apply to our person sitting in front of us. And the reality is everybody's receptivity to intervention is highly individualized. We spoke about pharmacogenomics earlier, right? There's another big, biostatistical number out there called number needed to treat. I don't want to get into that. It's in my book, but that takes into account whether or not that person's going to respond to intervention or not. So I say all that because I think it's going to be important to follow the standards of care, work with your conventional physician, ologist here first, right? Because that's their bread and butter and their specialty, whether that's a disease modifying agent or some sort of monoclonal antibody that is used to acutely stabilize the clinical presentation in front of us, whatever it might be. But then I encourage my patients to let's then take that deep dive. Let's start peeling back the layers. Are there genetic factors, immunological factors, and microbiome factors? Are there environmental factors? And I think taking that composite of data and information is going to be critical to then, essentially reverse engineer what's going on so that we could identify where we need to focus our attention to. And then I use digital twinning in my practice, where I actually pull all these advanced tests into a digital twin of your basic avatar, so that we could then look at how to, further expand upon this information in a targeted approach. I look at and review everything manually, and then I cross check what I think manually to what the digital twin shows. And then I'm able to merge the two pieces of information for us to develop a very highly individualized N of one protocol and plan of action.
I love the personalized approach because every human is different.
Oh, yeah.
Earlier, you mentioned using your genetic makeup to determine best diet type, or you said some people who have high protein diets might have certain inflammatory markers. But can you take that information to say, okay, you, Amy, should eat low carb, or you, doctor, should eat this way?
In my practice, I use a multitude of different resources to add on to the individualization layers and programming of a dietetic protocol.
Mm.
I do believe that it's your macronutrients are going to be highly predicated on your VO2 max,
Okay.
right? Your fitness goals. So, and VO2 max is basically the rate of oxygen consumption that's influencing your metabolic state, right? How efficient your mitochondria are working to produce ATP, aka energy. So the VO2 max is the best proxy at your macronutrient protein fat carb ratios.
Do you test that?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
We have a device here in the office that we grade it. And some people just stop there, right? That's fantastic information for our athletes. They're able to identify their metabolic demands and macronutrient requirements. But then I encourage going additional layers deeper. And some of the layers, like I said, nutrigenomic associations, there's certain people that have a cluster of what's called HLA, DR, DQ genes that are associated with genetic predisposition towards gluten intolerance, sensitivity, or even full-blown celiac disease, right? So there's a spectrum there of intolerance, sensitivity, and allergy that influences somebody's ability to tolerate just simply gluten. As you may know, gluten's in everything. Then there's individuals that have, polymorphisms or genetic variations in their DNA that influences certain macro and micronutrient factors. So again, there's beta carotene SNPs, how well you absorb and assimilate vitamin A, essentially, vitamin D, so on and so forth. And then there are other, genes that influence, predispositions towards obesity, like the FTO gene. There's also, and then additional layers is when you put in the microbiome, and then you're like, hey, right now, your microbiome, you got to lean off the sugar, right? Because the sugar is driving this subset of the population up, and that's not good. And then,
doesn't everyone need to lay off the sugar?
Oh, yeah. Refined carbohydrates and sugars as a whole, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. That's one of our greatest, I would say, insults to the cell.
I guess it probably explains, though, we all know those people that can eat whatever they want and not gain weight. And then the rest of us, we eat the wrong things, and we do because they genetically have something else. But none of us should be eating it.
Yeah, there's so many different factors. It's just amazing to see. I have a lot of, couples that come to me, husband and wives, and they're always like, it's very interesting. Two totally different sets of DNA blueprints, two different microbial populations in their gut due to historical exposures, antibiotics, diet, and so forth. And oftentimes, even though they do the same thing routinely together, day in and day out, they will have two totally different burdens of what they're bioaccumulating from their environment, the toxic burden. And sometimes there's a lot of overlap, but I think, again, that genetic environmental mismatch is very interesting to see. But all these different factors, and then whether or not you believe in food sensitivities. Now, I do believe that there is some level and value and evidence to support food sensitivity profiling in individuals that have highly inflamed guts, right? And there's very specific protocols around, certain levels of avoidance based on that, just to allow the immune system to calm down a little bit. But there's a whole multifactorial kind of therapeutic order that needs to be followed when dealing with, gut health, diet, digestion, and so forth. It's kind of a layered approach, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I think in the past, a lot of this has been trial and error. Like you
Oh,
watch how your body responds to
yeah,
certain
yeah.
things, but now we have technology that can maybe get us there a little quicker.
Oh, absolutely. Definitely cut through the noise. Absolutely.
So if you have someone that maybe has limited resources or they can't do the whole thing, is there a spot that they should start? If you say, do nothing else, do this.
Yeah, and that's actually kind of where I wrote the book, is it'll be great to have all the data and information, especially as we're seeing a rise in direct to consumer diagnostic testing companies. And I have, my hesitation and reservations about endorsing any of those because there's varying levels of clinical, I always say reproducibility, accuracy, and actionability. So, I usually, I do think there's a blueprint out there that makes sense for individuals based on their tools and resources. And it just really depends on, their motivation, drive, and discipline to be able to become their agent, their own agent of health, their own CEO of their own health. And once you have that agency over things and you understand how these different factors influence the cause and effect relationship, you start noticing a trend and a difference on how people use this information for their own health and everything else. Because when it comes down to it, all the best medicine's free. Diet, exercise, sleep, and nutrition, meaning and purpose, loving and relationships, all that's foundational,
So
right?
lifestyle, our
Yeah,
most
yeah.
important
It sounds
thing that we can
critical.
control.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
just read the labels. Read the labels, right? Don't eat processed crap.
Even better if it doesn't have a label, right? Because it's real.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. And know what's in your kitchen, know what's in your
Yeah.
your bathroom, right? Try to use healthy cleaning products that aren't like weird chemicals and weird non-stick pans with PFAS and Teflon and all that stuff, right? Avoid the microplastics and the plastic containers and drinking out of plastic. It's very fundamental. Try to eat organic and avoid the organophosphates, right? Avoid the parabens and phthalates and get natural skincare products. It's just being more aware. I think it's very important to think for ourselves, question authority, and do what's more natural. How about that?
Yep. Perfect. So
Yeah.
we're almost out of time, but tell our listeners how they can find out more about you and connect, find your book, and tell them why your light looks a little funny.
So I'm in office seeing patients, running around from different rooms to rooms, procedures and so forth. I'm in my brick and mortar practice, the Institute for Human Optimization here in Maryland, but I am licensed in almost all 50. So I see patients all over the country. So I establish care everywhere, and even internationally, I have people flying in. I have a patient coming in from where are they coming in? Nigeria next week, and
Oh
then
my goodness.
England, and so forth. So I just had somebody from Indonesia, come and find me and establish care. So licensed in almost all 50, but work, all over. Have the brick and mortar practice, the Institute for Human Optimization, where we have a bunch of fun toys, hyperbaric oxygen, intermittent hypoxic, hyperoxic therapy. And right now, since I'm always doing stuff, I don't like the high flicker fluorescent light bulbs. It's actually kind of not good for you. So I stay under red light at baseline and cruise control so that it's not causing a little bit of neuro fatigue. And I tried it out first, I was just like, all right, let's, see patients under regular lights. Then I turned the lights off and turn on the red, with all the research on mitochondrial, biogenesis and its influence on cytochrome C oxidase and whatnot. I just feel better under red, So
And it looks cool too.
Yeah. Makes my head a little bit shinier too. But and we got the book coming out. It's called The Biological 401k later this year. And patients or individuals could find me on social media, Not hard to find. Again, the Institute for Human Optimization, anilbajnath.com, and then for physicians, we're casting a larger educational net for any doctor out there, with the American Board of Precision Medicine, the abopm.org. And we're actually finalizing our curriculum to enroll our first cohort here to undergo training physicians to start thinking this way about kind of what we just discussed and unpacked here in your on this podcast and segment. Because if we're not leveraging these advanced molecular profiles, sometimes we're still playing that disease-centric, reductionistic, pill for ill kind of model. And I think, which is good, it's a standard of the care. It's where I trained here with the University of Maryland. But how do we advance that narrative to offer more to our patients?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's such a great resource. I look forward to seeing what you do.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you.
Thanks again for being here today.
Yeah, thank you so much.
And thanks to our listeners for tuning in to Energize and Revitalize with Dr. Amy.
Awesome.
If you have insights from this show, send me an email at radiantpodcast2025@gmail.com. I'll be back next Saturday morning at 7:30 with more expert insights and practical strategies to help you live a radiant and healthy life. Until then, stay curious, stay informed, and keep energizing your life.